Everyone can hear me okay? Awesome. All right, so I'm going to go through some basic steps to get introduced with back-end development with Node.js. I understand that most people here are going to be front-end devs, because it's front-end Northeast. But yeah, Node.js is a prominent thing. It's been getting larger and larger over the years. And yeah, let's just get started. Might as well. Yeah, before I mention anything, all the content and code used in these slides will be put up on GitHub eventually. I don't know when, soon. And forgive the Twitter handle. I don't know why it's that. I've got a tech blog as well. I've generated that with Jekyll, which is pretty cool. There's not a lot on there yet, but it'll update. So, firstly, who am I? I'm a JavaScript dev at Bead Gaming. My main project at the moment is dev and support for a large-scale API facade that's written in Happy, which you'll be learning about soon. I'm rewriting a slots game engine server, Happy again. You can see a pattern here. Rarely, I do some client-side JavaScript, so I'm predominantly a back-end developer, where I'm adding new features and bug fixes to slots games. So I'm using Marionette, Phaser, Pixie. I've missed Orchestra off that list, but I do use it. And in side projects, I'm currently writing a course for Pluralsight called RESTful API Design Implementation Using Happy. And besides that, I'm writing, when I can, an application called Knots, which I'm basically teaching myself to write debugging and IDE-like stuff using a text editor. So yeah, an interactive localized JavaScript / Node.js compiler / debugger / static analysis tool, which has been pretty interesting so far, as I'm learning things like process signaling and core backend stuff, which you didn't think would be possible until recently. So yeah, what's covered today? Firstly, I'm going to go over servers just in general. Like, what are they? What do they do? Why do we need them? I'm going to go over what is Node.js. Who wants to load for me? Oh, there we go. OK. So yeah, I'm going to go over what is Node. I'm going to say why you should use it. I'm going to go over require HTTP, which is a core library in JavaScript, Node.js. I'm going to go over Express and Koa because they're very similar. I'm going to go over Happy, of course. I'll talk about sales. Obviously, I think a lot of people who've used it know that it's dying out, but it needs to, because it's still popular, so it still needs to be used. I'll then obviously have a conclusion, and then obviously you'll have some questions straight after. All right, so moving from front end to back end coding. I think the next picture sums up the initial shock most people get when they're writing front end code and then realize that they could do the same thing in back end. So yeah, we've all seen that before, but yeah, that's basically what it's like. So yeah, servers, basically the relation between client and server is how you need to think about that, because there is a client-server relationship model, and all content you access from the browser is effectively served to you. Before we get learning into some core things about Node, I want to kind of start with what the real relationship is between the client and the server, because the most stuff most people here will be used to writing is client-facing work, like web applications, stuff like that. All content that you access via a web browser has to come from somewhere. So even if you have localized client functionality, there will be server interaction at some point, even if it's just when you want to access a particular page. So when you go into your web browser, google.com, server hits instantly. So these days, this process is pretty dynamic, given that we're now writing web applications. And in reality, it has never really been as complex as it is these days. JavaScript web applications are emerging, and thus the client-server relationship just continues to grow and be more complicated. So who here has opened a web page before? Nice. All right. Who here has logged into a website? Goes without saying. And now about editing your profile after said login. Same thing again. So a good analogy to understand this is the concept of a restaurant. So in a restaurant, you have customers and you have waiters, obviously. So the client could be seen as the customer, and the server can be seen, obviously, as the waiter. From the moment that a customer sits down at a restaurant, a request to the waiter has already begun, because they know they have acknowledged someone is sitting down, therefore they must go over to greet and grab the initial orders from them. The initial order is then taken by the waiter to be handled effectively, and this is an ongoing communications process until, of course, the customer leaves, as you would. So yeah, actions like grabbing data, logging in, all part of the process. So this poorly drawn diagram, if you can see that, cool. Yeah, basically explains that. Think of it as a communication between 1 to X people, or whatever it is like that. Think of it heuristically. So more often this process needs to be dynamic. And yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to get started with Node. So localized JavaScript runtime, utilizing currently the Google V8 engine. That's the same thing that drives the Chrome browser as well, and they are in sync. So new features of JavaScript, and when they appear in the browser, sometimes, not completely sync, but they tend to appear in Node as well. Node is effectively, so the runtime is your code executor. That basically is when it looks at your code, it interprets what you have, and then tries to make an output based on what you've done, or tries to run it. Node is a mechanism for writing and running localized JavaScript. It's the simplest way to say it, rather than relying on a browser. And you can think of basically what you've got next as an interactive console, which is known as a REPL, which is a read, eval, print loop, which is basically interprets what you have on a line-by-line basis. If you ever use console in your web inspector, like Chrome DevTools or something like that, then you've obviously done this before to test out code and code policies and that kind of stuff. It's effectively just localized that. It ships with a great library, which is what I'm going to talk about one of them soon, and it's got its own package manager, NPM. Now, recently there's been a bit of controversy around NPM, given that it actually unpublished someone's packages, but it's still good. It's still got a lot of stuff on there, so it's still worth using. As I've mentioned, it has an explosion in popularity over the past few years because people can interact with the servers from client-side knowledge. If they know JavaScript, you can transfer that knowledge, at least the core essentials, to writing servers, which effectively makes people multifaceted in their work, which is brilliant. Next step is why Node.js. So the first and most important reason is the event-based server execution, which is also known as the event loop. Now, if you've worked in browsers before, you know what event-driven programming is. So you know that on events, you do something X, Y, Z, that kind of thing. The event loop is a constantly async, non-blocking execution cycle. That sounds complicated, but it's not as complicated as it sounds. It just basically means that rather than waiting for things to stop and finish in synchronous manner, you can let things do their own thing whilst you continue working. That's how Node is single-threaded and yet performs brilliantly under load. Like, for example, something I've been working on recently, hit production a few weeks ago, and it's serving 500,000 hits a day now, and it's not even breaking a sweat. It's handling it perfectly. So basically it allows you to do multiple things without waiting for those things to actually complete, so long as they call back eventually. Call back, it's a hint. No waiting for I/O blockers, things like file reading, access external web services like getting stuff from an external place, external device reads, anything considered blocking. As I mentioned before, it uses the fast V8 Google engine, which is also using Chrome, and we'll have the option for using something called Chakra soon. Who knows what Chakra is? I mean, I've said there, but how's it being used? I know you know. Right, it's an engine that's being used in Internet Explorer and currently being used in Edge, and they're going to use it to bring in an IoT-style thing. Who knows what the IoT is? No. Oh, yeah? Exactly. And so what that basically means is it represents all physical devices connected to a network and what is involved for them to communicate and exchange data. It's also being used for embedded systems programming with Node, so circuit program, maybe even Raspberry Pis at some point. Tremendous global popularity and support everywhere. It is being supported globally because of its just knowledge transfer, like I've mentioned here. And I think that's quite a lot of good reasons, to be honest, to use something. Next step is getting into Node. So to use the HTTP server and client, one must require HTTP. That's actually taken from the documentation, so I think someone had a bit of fun with that, Mr. Node.js. But it's based loosely off the Python simple HTTP server library. I don't think a lot of people have used that again here, because that's back-end stuff. But it provides minimal functionality to create a web server. So if you want to start a web server, it gives you the basic ways to do it. It's effective when writing simple applications, but it also becomes cumbersome when writing things that are complex, which I'll go into soon. It does allow you to get right into the nitty-gritty of things, so to speak. So a basic example, I hope you can see this. Is that readable at the back? No, brilliant. Okay, I'll run you through it in that case. But basically what we're doing is we're requiring the main HTTP library in. After that, we are creating an instance of that server, and we're basically writing some headers and a payload. Now, I've got some custom headers in here, like x-heaven-knows, Morrissey.is miserable now, just for the hell of it. At the end of this, you listen on the port, and it's very raw. You're declaring headers, you are declaring payloads, and you're giving it an exact format. So, yeah, I'll give you some drawbacks. Unfortunately, I didn't know you could read that. It's going to be a bit of a pain. I'll try and zoom in if I can. Highlight text, I'll try that. I'll zoom. Okay. All right. So HTTP was never really designed with complex server applications in mind, like APIs, game servers, that kind of thing. It's an entry point for people who are transitioning from front end to back end, really, for writing your own servers in JavaScript. However, it did start and spark the explosion that we're about to see. But yeah, it's perfect for basic usage. It's a nightmare for anything complex or non-trivial. It lacks native request routing, middleware integration, authentication, logging, caching, that kind of stuff. It's got a high entry level for writing servers, so you need to understand things like buffers, MIME types, content encoding, that kind of thing. It's really not built for complex server applications at all, which brings us on to, I guess you can probably guess what the next one is. It's Express. Right, so Express is a fast, unopinionated, minimalist framework for Node.js. And just to demonstrate how popular this thing is, if I can see this, I'm going to go to npm stats.com. And we're going to see, if I can do this, yep, how popular Express actually is. So, over the last year, that's gone. Oh no, there we are. It's had 16 million downloads just for usage this year, which to me is pretty crazy. But yeah, so it's a powerful, widely supported framework. It's built on top of an existing library called Connect. That was basically the start of making things complicated. It has a very similar look and feel, but obviously it didn't get as popular. It's by far the most popular, as we've just seen. Frameworks currently in existence. Provides tons of functionality via things known as middleware, which is effectively something you plug into your application to do certain things, such as routing, authentication, request parsing, that kind of stuff. And it's the first real serious framework that caused an explosion of popularity. Now, I've got some more code, but I'll try and zoom in on this one. Oh, before I forget, it's also part of Node's incubator program, which basically means that this thing is so popular, we need to maintain it to keep it alive, because it's being used 17 million times a year just for usage. So, and the next thing passes control through routes and middleware via Next. I'll get onto that soon. But I'll try and give this some code examples. I'll zoom in on this screen and see if that helps. So, it's not actually zooming much in at all. Oh well. Never mind. Never mind. I'll highlight it. Is that readable at all? No. Brilliant. Brilliant. Okay. All right, so basically what I'm doing there is I'm calling something called app.get, which then passes in something as a path, which is just /users. So all the requests that go to /users will then be handled by this. I'm passing a request and a response object to this, and I'm sending back a basic thing called a list of users can be retrieved here. I need to zoom out a little bit more. We've got body parsing, so things like request payloads, making sure that you can handle the request payload type properly. In that instance, we call require body parser, and then we app.use bodyparser.json just so it has somewhere to handle it. And to serve static content, it's app.use again, but this time you're passing in a route, so /static, for example, and then basically you're mentioning it where it goes to express.static public. Basically just says that it has to be public. I'll get on to the next ones. More code. So in this example, I'm creating a CRUD application. For those at the back, what is CRUD? Nearly. There we go. That's the one. So I've made a very basic CRUD application here. Very basic in the fact that we're not even using any real middleware in this application at all. I'm creating 4 routes, hence CRUD. There's an endpoint to create users, which just sends back a response saying user with the request body that you've created. It's really not complex at all. We've got get, which is the retrieve, so it gets the list of users. The put is to update, and that takes in /users/ID. So you can reference the ID of the player or the user that you're using. And then you can obviously update that with a payload. And then obviously if you want to remove that instance of data, you can just app.delete on that. So the syntax for declaring routes and methods in Express is app.method. So if you think of an HTTP method, things like get, post, put, patch, that kind of thing, it basically corresponds to that. I'll get off the code now. So yeah, great so far, right? But there are some cons to this. Firstly, it has a surprisingly large footprint for it being a minimal, unopinionated framework. It's one of the reasons why a lot of the core developers for Express have moved on to something else. It has no built-in error handling, which is not great. Yet another middleware syndrome. I think we've all heard of yet another framework syndrome, because we all work with JavaScript at some point. It's the same with Express. There are a lot of middleware solutions out there that people have tailored slightly differently just to what they have. And sometimes the support disappears after 6 months, and you're still using it in a production environment, which isn't brilliant. It's now part of the incubator program. I know I said that's a pro, but it's also a con at the same time, because one of the core founders of Express has moved on to something new, which is what I'm going to talk about soon. And because of the popularity of it, they need to keep it supported, and they need to keep it alive. So they're incubating it to make sure it doesn't lose support, and critical bugs can get fixed. Yeah, gradually losing support and popularity because it's just not really fit for ES6. A lot of people move on to its successor. And who can guess what the successor is? Anyone? Yeah, Koa, that's the one. Right, so Koa is a next-generation web framework for Node.js. Basically, it's designed by the people who made Express, by, well, a large majority of the people who made Express. It has a tiny footprint in comparison to its predecessor. It provides true middleware cascading in a stack-like manner. I'll explain next, and that's soon. And it's very similar to Express, so no framework overhead if you're moving from Express to Koa. It manages and more through the concept of what's known as generators. Who can tell me what a JavaScript generator is before I get on that? No, it's a hard one. Actually, yeah?
So you can use the asynchronous code like you would synchronously.
Yes. Basically, yes. So we've got generators in Koa and an overview, and we've got the syntax, which I'll just describe to you because you can't see it at the back, but we do have the meaning behind that. So I've generated what's known as a function, and with a star at the front of the function name. And here we are passing in 3 keywords, which is just yield, foo, bar, and baz. And what basically that allows you to do is to pause and resume execution of your function using the yield keyword. Now, that doesn't seem important right now. I mean, why would you want to pause a function from running? But as we mentioned before, they have asynchronous code. And when things don't complete in time, you get undefined, which isn't brilliant. So in Koa, we have an example here, which the same syntax as Express. It's app.use. And in there, you pass a function, a generator function, with the word next in. And what we're doing here is getting a start date. I'm yielding the keyword next, which means I'm passing it on to the next piece of middleware, because that's what next effectively does. It just passes it on to the next piece of middleware for a request. And then I'm calculating the milliseconds between that date and the start. And then I'm setting a header, which is just x-brew time for coffee. And then the body's just brew complete at the end. And so generators in Koa are used to pass request contexts through middleware layers for processing. We've already been through how it goes because you can't see it, so just go through it from there. And then another example. I'll go through this quickly because it's very similar to the Express one. The only difference is that I'm passing in a generator to the root rather than a method or a callback even, which yields the result of a database call, which, as was mentioned, is asynchronous. So there are some cons to this framework. It sounds brilliant so far, but there are some cons to it. Everything in Koa is a plugin. Everything, down to the routing itself. So including serving static content, routing requests to certain endpoints, which are both native in Express. They really have tried to cut down on the content as much as they can. Nowhere near as popular as the other contenders, like Express, happy. I think it gets about 500,000 last year, which isn't great, given the other one had 17 million. It forces devs to understand a difficult concept, as we've just described, which is generators. Not a lot of people know about that when writing JavaScript, because it's something that's coming up, it's new. And given it it's the next generation web framework, that's kind of why they're doing it. It's got a lack of support for Node versions less than 0.12. Now, Node's exploded recently because of the merger with IOJS, but there are still people, we use it somewhere, that are using versions less than 0.12 in production. So if they want to upgrade, it's difficult. It's just not really, it's not wide recommended to do it, even with Babel. Which leads us on to definitely not my favorite, even though I use it everywhere, which is Happy.js, which is what's known as a rich framework for building applications and services. It's developed in-house at Walmart Labs and then released open source. It provides what's known as a configuration over code design ethics for writing servers and applications. It's easily maintainable for when your applications get complicated, like, say, for example, writing an API, writing something where there's going to be at least 10 different routes for you to access. It's got an incredible plugin ecosystem for your production-ready apps. A lot of its plugins are named after things from Ren and Stimpy. So you've got things like Joy, you've got Confidence, you've got Poop and Boom. Brilliant plugins, but they're all named after things like Ren and Stimpy, which is great as well. It's got a very active community, active change history, active everywhere, basically. It's still being used, one of the most popular at the time. The most interesting thing about Happy is that it was battle tested, which means they released it live into production on Black Friday using a seriously small stack. Now that stack was 10 CPU cores and 28 gigabytes of RAM, and it didn't even go over above, it idled at 0.75% load most of the time during Black Friday, which is insane. And it's got 100% code coverage, which is brilliant, which is what we all want. So some more code here where we are defining a route. Rather than giving it a route in the parameters, you're defining an object inside the route, which is a parameter here, which takes the method, which is get in this example, takes a path, which for us is just ping, because why not? It takes a handler, which passes in the request and the reply of the request that's currently going through, and it replies with hello world. Simple, really. And then to serve static content, you need to register what's known as a plugin in Happy called inert, which just needs registering in Happy. And then there, it's the same thing, but you're passing in /home, and you're passing in the file, and then it renders it straight away. So yeah, a basic Happy.js example. It's the same thing again. You define a new server, you're calling it in, and you're giving it a connection, which is, in this instance, is just a port number of 3000. After that, passing in two routes, one that takes in a parameter of name, and one that takes in a parameter of ID and just passes them back. It's really nothing complicated at this stage, because I haven't got enough screen revenue. But there are some cons to using Happy.js. Recently, we've noticed, definitely noticed, that there are breaking changes everywhere. Happy upgrades major versions far too often. It's just the cause of having an active community. You find a breaking change and you have to update it because you just do. Its preferred functionality is using the ecosystem's plugins. There's about 10 or 12 of them, and they are brilliant, but they are limiting. And it's kind of difficult to strap that out and put your own in. Like logging, for example. Logging is attached to all the events that Happy emits, but you want more than that in real-life situations and systems. And if you want to change it, it becomes a pain. New versions keep cutting out core functionality that you need in a server, such as query parameter parsing, which is vital for APIs these days. And finally, the next and last framework I'll go through today is known as Sails. It's a traditional MVC-style convention over code server framework that adopts heavily from Ruby on Rails. Who knows what Ruby on Rails is? Does anybody use it? Awesome. Great. So you briefly understand how it works. So it comes as standard with a native ORM, which is just an object relational mapping, basically for your database. It's like a schema, allows you to write and read queries and stuff, called Waterline, which is database agnostic. Now what that means is that you can write queries here, and it will try and attempt to translate them to your preferred database, which is really cool, because writing database queries suck. It's data-driven at its core, via what's known as data modeling and named associations. And it's got native WebSocket support, which is awesome. It's got great generators for all major components for your app. So if you want to generate a new application, you install it globally, and it's Sails generate X name, and it sets up everything for you. And it has a configurable asset pipeline. So those who've used Rails before know what an asset pipeline is. It basically manages and compresses your pipeline, your assets through what's known as a pipeline, and feeds it to the page in a streamlined manner via Grunt, even though Grunt's not pipes. It has the ability to auto-generate REST APIs based on a resource. So, for example, if you want to generate a REST API, which is basically almost CRUD in certain ways, but with a bit more to it, you can just do Sails new REST, I believe it's REST, and then you pass in the resource, and it'll generate it all for you in code, which is awesome and saves a lot of time. And yeah, it's basically all driven by commands until you're really wanting to customize it. Now, the next one says, show me the code. I could do that, but there's a lot of it, and no one can see it, so I'm not going to do that, but I will put it online. And to be honest, it's kind of one of the cons of Sails, which I will get onto now. So as you may have noticed, I'll get onto it next, but as a framework, it is slowly dying, and there's a reason for that. It's not getting very many contributions at the moment because a lot of the team are leaving because the main founder isn't allowing people to contribute, which seems kind of contradictory given it's open source. It doesn't like you doing custom things. Everything is generated for you. Me showing you the code would be brilliant, but it would be new to a lot of people, even me, because it generates everything for you. It's very steep learning curve when you actually want to tailor it to fit your needs. Like the asset pipeline, like things like data modeling, ORMs. This is stuff that people who are new to this kind of stuff don't really want to learn straight away. They want to kind of get into the basics. It's got a number of bugs that have been stale and are yet to be fixed. And that's pretty much it, which brings us on to the conclusion. Node comes with a number of dynamic and powerful server frameworks and has a very decent native HTTP module that you can do basic stuff with. It has Express, obviously, in the most popular part. It's an incubated application now. However, the core developer has left, and there's a need for the incubator. Koa is the next step, as they've defined it, for Express-like applications, but it has a generator learning curve, and it's lowish on popularity. Happy is best for defining large-scale and complex APIs, down to its simple server apps, but it's worst for simple server applications because of its configuration and its single business logic calls, like a gaming server. And then there's Sails, which is fully featured, but it's got sluggish patching, and its core team is effectively dead. There is a number of honorable mentions that I can make, things to look out for if you're interested in this. First one is known as Adonis, which is an MVC-style framework that's regular. It's getting up to date. It's got ES6 bindings into it. It's looking really promising. And there's Nodal, which is more MVC, which is basically another generator. It seems a lot more up to date, though, so it's definitely promising. There's Loopback, which is enterprise IBM style Express, which is still being updated and maintained. It's still built on Express, but they've had a lot of stuff to it. A lot of the stuff you see in Sails, like assets, pipeline, architecture, data-driven things, and ORM mappings are available in Loopback, which is pretty good. Flatiron, which is basically the company's called Flatiron, and it's core development Express. It's similar to Loopback, except it's not enterprise. It's not IBM. It's just another open source model. There's Feathers, which is just a new and shiny HTTP and WebSockets framework. That's looking pretty promising, but I did try to install it the other day, and it bugged out on me, so there's that. There's Trails, which is the next step for Sails, which is basically the people who were refused the right to build the stuff on Sails have just forked it and started doing their own thing. Someone actually had a go at me the other day on GitHub because I asked if it was active, and they said, of course it is. So, yeah, it's definitely active from that one. I haven't really got anything else to cover, so I guess we could cover questions.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes for questions.
Okay, yep.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
It's a strange question. It's about Node in general.
Okay.
And it might seem like a negative question, but it's not. I actually love Node, and I use it all the time for
Absolutely.
personal projects. When Node first came around, there was a lot of fanfare about the potential for code reuse between client and server.
Absolutely.
So,
Isomorphic
for
code.
example, models and things like that.
Yeah.
But we've seen very little of that. I was just wondering what your thoughts on why that was.
That's a very good question. I personally haven't used it as much to really give you a good enough answer for that, because I still believe in there's a server and client separation. I think there should be a client-server model because it's what people are used to, and it's what I'm used to. As far as isomorphic JavaScript goes, I know there are people like React and a few other places that do it, but at the moment I think it's still quite in its infancy. So approach it with caution, I would say. Any more questions? No? Oh, yep.
So on a semi-related topic, do you have any experience with the ORMs for Node?
Besides Waterline?
Yeah.
I've used something called Dogwater, which is made by Happy, of course, because that's the name, and that seems pretty good. I've used Mongoose as well, which is pretty cool. It's basically just a MongoDB wrapper. They're all quite different, and they all got to takes getting used to. And there are some notable problems with some of them, like inner joins can't be accessed properly through, I think it's Waterline, which is something you need when you're accessing a relational database. Yeah. But yeah, I think it depends on what you're using. If you want something that's agnostic, go for it, because why not? It makes your life easier. Yeah. But there are specific databases that probably have better ORMs that they've released themselves.
All right, cool. Thanks.
No problem. Any more? Yep, cool. Yeah. Oh, of course, yeah. It's Connects as well, which is another one which is built off Bookshelf, but yeah, pretty good. Any more questions, or are we out of time?
Pretty much out of time.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you.